Chapter 1. The sound of fracturing mana stone echoed through the fortress of the abyss, like snapping bone. Heat radiated from the towering crimson pillar at Torin's back, searing through the thin, torn fabric of his shirt. Iron shackles bit deep into his wrists, the metal slick with his own sweat and blood. Beneath him, the grand magical sandbox of the continent hummed. Its intricate ley lines glowed with a volatile, unnatural light, casting harsh shadows across his bruised face. For 3 days, the queen of the bloodstone dragons had kept him chained to this very spot. Torin's analytical mind, a mortal brain uniquely capable of dissecting the most complex arcane algorithms in seconds, felt dangerously sluggish. The map before him was a chaotic web of geometry, representing the impenetrable shield of the royal capital. He already knew the answer. The mathematical flaw was right there, hiding in the intersection of the celestial meridians, but he would never speak it. He dragged in a jagged breath. The air in the chamber was thick, choking him with the scent of ozone, crushed ash, and something distinctly, terrifyingly predatory. Footsteps clicked against the obsidian floor, slow, deliberate. Zylia emerged from the shadows. The Dragon Queen did not merely walk, she glided, a sovereign of absolute ruin. Her aura hit Torin before she even touched him. It was a crushing physical weight that forced the oxygen from his lungs and made his mortal instincts scream at him to submit. He gritted his teeth, fighting the violent biological urge to lower his eyes. She stopped mere inches from him. The ambient temperature in the room spiked to a fever pitch. Slowly she raised a hand. Her nails, coated in hardened, iridescent crimson scales, traced the sharp line of his jaw. The tip of her index talon came to rest directly over his racing pulse, pressing just hard enough to threaten the delicate skin. 24 hours, little cryptographer, Zylia murmured. Her voice was a dark, velvet purr that vibrated directly into his chest. That is all the time you have to unravel the royal barrier. Find the flaw in their magical equation, or I will start peeling the flesh from your bones. Torin stared back into her slitted, glowing amber eyes. His heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs, but his mind remained a fortress of cold logic. He gathered the pooling metallic taste in his mouth and spat. The blood mixed with saliva landed sharply on the toe of her obsidian boot. "Go to hell," Torin rasped, his voice raw. "I would rather bite off my own tongue and choke on it than hand humanity over to a monster." A terrible silence stretched across the chamber. Zylia looked down at her boot, then back up to his face. She did not strike him. She did not roar in fury. Instead, a slow, terrifyingly beautiful smile curved her lips. "Such fire," she whispered, leaning closer until her lips brushed the shell of his ear. "Such magnificent, stubborn fire. You think your refusal makes you noble. You think of her, don't you?" Torin's breath hitched. Odette, her sweet, gentle smile, the promise of a quiet, unremarkable life by the coast. She was waiting for him. She was the anchor, keeping his sanity tethered in this blazing abyss. "Keep her name out of your mouth," Torin snarled, pulling against the chains. The metal groaned in protest. Zylia laughed. It was a low, melodic sound that sent a shiver down his spine despite the blistering heat. Her thumb stroked his cheekbone. The contrast between the lethal sharpness of her talons and the smooth, searing heat of her skin sent a confusing electrical shock through his nervous system. "The love of a mortal is a pathetic, fragile thing," she said softly. The possessiveness in her tone was visceral, dark, and utterly twisted. She stepped fully into his space, her alpha presence wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. Let us see if the memory of her can protect your mind from my flames. Let us see how long it takes for you to realize that you belong to me now." Torin wanted to recoil. He hated her. He hated the arrogant, absolute certainty in her eyes. But as her magic seeped into his skin, a traitorous warmth rushed through his veins. His body was reacting to her power, acknowledging her dominance, even as his mind fought a desperate war of resistance. She tilted his chin up, preparing to speak again. Boom! The western wall of the chamber exploded inward. A shockwave of dark magic ripped through the room, shattering the illuminated sandbox into 1,000 glittering shards. Smoke and stone dust choked the air. Torin coughed violently, his eyes watering from the sudden blast of debris. Above them, the ceiling grates blew open. A dozen shadows dropped from the rafters. They moved with unnatural liquid speed, completely silent despite the chaos. They wore no insignias, only pitch-black armor that absorbed the ambient light of the roaring fires. Zylia's eyes flared blindingly bright. A guttural snarl ripped from her throat, the sound of an apex predator challenged in its own den. Her body began to shift, crimson scales erupting along her forearms as the air around her ignited into a defensive inferno. But the assassins didn't look at the queen. As the thick smoke cleared, Torin froze. 12 mechanized crossbows, dripping with a foul green necrotic poison, were raised in perfect unison. None of them were aimed at Zylia. Every single weapon was pointed directly at Torin's heart. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you are captivated by Torin and Zylia's dark journey and want to hear what happens next, please subscribe to Velmora Obsession. Don't forget to like, comment, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of our exclusive dark romance stories. Chapter 2. The twang of a dozen bowstrings snapping in unison was the loudest sound Torin had ever heard. Time violently dilated. The deadly trajectory of the crossbow bolts, dripping with glowing necrotic venom, etched itself into his analytical mind. He had exactly a fraction of a second left to live. He squeezed his eyes shut and braced for the piercing, icy agony of death. It never came. Instead, a wall of solid, blistering heat slammed into his chest, knocking the remaining oxygen from his lungs. Zylia. She had thrown herself directly into the line of fire, shielding his fragile mortal body with her own. A sickening hiss echoed through the chamber as one of the poisoned arrows grazed her bare shoulder. The toxic steel tore through her flesh, melting the edge of her gown before embedding itself deep into the stone pillar behind them. Zylia did not flinch. She did not scream. A guttural, bone-rattling roar erupted from the depths of her chest, a sound that belonged to an apex predator whose mate had just been threatened. The air pressure in the room snapped. Massive wings woven from crystallized, incandescent bloodfire burst from her shoulder blades, shattering the ceiling arches into a rain of debris. She launched herself at the assassins. It was not a battle. It was a visceral, terrifying slaughter. Torin watched in paralyzed awe as the elegant, composed queen vanished, replaced by an archaic force of nature. She moved with liquid, lethal grace. Claws of hardened obsidian sheared through pitch-black armor like it was wet parchment. "Oh, by the stone, she's lost her mind again," a high-pitched, gravelly voice shrieked. Quigley, the bat-sized gargoyle, scrambled frantically across the floor and dove headfirst under an overturned iron cauldron, his tiny stone claws clicking against the tiles. This is bad for the feng shui. Very bad. Torin ignored the creature. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, pumping adrenaline through his veins. His sharp eyes darted away from the carnage and locked onto the obsidian floor. The assassin's blood was pooling rapidly, thick and dark, creeping toward the shattered remains of the magical sandbox. Conductivity. Blood was the ultimate organic conductor for arcane energy. His mind, a terrifyingly precise machine, instantly kicked into overdrive. While Zylia was completely consumed by the intoxicating haze of violence, tearing the spine from the final intruder, Torin dropped to his knees. His muscles screamed in protest. He dragged his heavy, shackled hands toward a jagged shard of broken laystone. Gripping the sharp edge until it bit into his palm, he reached out and dipped the stone into the encroaching pool of fresh crimson. Closing his eyes, he visualized the complex mathematical architecture of the binding spell on his wrists. He didn't need magic to break it. He just needed the inverse equation. With rapid, frantic strokes, he dragged the bloody stone across the floor beneath him, drawing a chaotic, counterclockwise geometric sequence. The moment he closed the final blood loop, the air popped. The iron cuffs glowing around his wrists flashed white-hot, then instantly crumbled into fine gray dust. Torin stumbled backward, rubbing his raw, bleeding wrists. He was free. He looked up. Zylia stood amidst the ruin, her back to him. Her chest heaved with rhythmic, violent force. The dark, necrotic poison from the arrow graze hissed fiercely against the scales on her shoulder, but she seemed completely impervious to the pain. She had taken a lethal strike meant for him. A strange, twisted knot tightened deep in Torin's stomach. A confusing surge of gratitude and an undeniable primal pull warred against his logic. Why would she risk herself for a prisoner? But then, the phantom scent of sea salt and wildflowers washed over his memory. Odette, the promise of the coast, the life he had bled to protect. Torin gritted his teeth, burying the treacherous spark of empathy. He spun on his heel, vaulted over the rubble of the western wall, and sprinted directly into the suffocating darkness of the toxic thorn forest. The woods were a nightmare of jagged bark and hallucinogenic fog. Thorns tore at his clothes, slashing hot, stinging lines across his forearms and cheeks. His lungs burned. The air here was heavy with poisonous spores, but sheer willpower pushed the venom aside. He ran like a hunted animal. He could see the tree line thinning ahead. The pale, pristine moonlight of the neutral zone spilled across the damp, mossy earth. 10 yards. 5 yards. Freedom was so close he could taste it. Suddenly, the ground beneath his boots violently trembled. The moonlight vanished, swallowed whole by a colossal shadow that blotted out the stars. A concussive shock wave of heat slammed into Torin's back, throwing him face first into the freezing mud. Before he could even draw a breath to scream, a crushing, unyielding weight settled across his hips. Blazing crimson wings boxed him in, vaporizing the damp soil into a thick, blinding steam. Torin was flipped over with terrifying, effortless ease. Zylia straddled him, pinning his wrists to the earth with a grip that promised shattered bones if he dared to resist. The civilized, calculating queen was completely gone. Looking down at him through the rising steam was a feral creature of the abyss. Her amber eyes burned with an ancient, bottomless hunger, and as she leaned down, the suffocating, intoxicating heat of her alpha presence swallowed him whole. Chapter 3. The freezing mud squelched beneath Torin's back, a stark, jarring contrast to the living furnace pressing down on him. He thrashed. It was a wild, desperate surge of pure, mortal panic. His hands, still slick with his own blood, scrambled blindly through the muck until his fingers brushed the cold, familiar steel of a dagger. He had pulled it from the corpse of an assassin moments before his frantic sprint. Without a second of hesitation, Torin gripped the hilt and drove the poisoned blade upward, burying it deep into the thick, muscular meat of Zylia's thigh. The steel sank to the hilt. Zylia did not flinch. She did not even blink. She simply looked down at the weapon protruding from her leg, then slowly shifted her glowing amber gaze back to his face. A low, terrifying purr vibrated deep within her chest, rattling Torin's ribs. "Did you truly believe you could outrun a predator in the dark, little cryptographer, Queen Zylia?" she whispered. Her voice was velvet wrapping a razor blade. "Odette!" Torin screamed, the name tearing from his throat in a raw, ragged plea. It was a prayer to the only light he had left in this nightmare, a desperate hope that somehow she was safe. It was a fatal mistake. The air pressure in the woods violently collapsed. Zylia's eyes fractured, the warm amber swallowed by a terrifying, possessive crimson. Jealousy, ancient, feral, and utterly suffocating, radiated from her pores, spiking the ambient temperature until the damp earth beneath them began to bake. She seized his jaw. Her hardened obsidian claws bit sharply into his cheeks, forcing his head to tilt to the side. The vulnerable, pulsing line of his neck was laid bare in the pale moonlight. "You belong to me," the Dragon Queen hissed against his skin, her breath a scorching brand. Mind, body, and soul, her fangs elongated. They were needle-sharp, dripping with the raw, chaotic magic of the abyss. Torin squeezed his eyes shut. She sank them into the hollow of his throat. Agony tore through his nervous system. It was not just the physical tearing of flesh. It was a white-hot, ethereal fire being injected directly into his veins. Torin arched his spine off the ground, a strangled gasp ripping past his lips. The blood, tear, seal. He knew the arcane theory behind it, but feeling it was entirely different. It was an archaic, parasitic tether. It hijacked his life force, forcefully weaving his heartbeat into the rhythmic, thunderous drumming of hers. He tasted the metallic tang of her power. It coated his tongue and burned down his throat. He hated her. He hated the utter, humiliating helplessness of his mortal body. Yet as the agonizing burn crested and began to fade into a strange, intoxicating warmth, a dark betrayal bloomed in his subconscious. The connection was intoxicating. His trembling fingers, which should have been clawing at her eyes, instinctively curled into the hardened scales at her hips. He was anchoring himself to the very monster consuming him. Zylia pulled back slowly. The savage hunger in her eyes had melted into a heavily lidded, dark satisfaction. A single drop of his blood smeared across her bottom lip. She lifted a thumb, gently swiping it over the puncture wounds. The touch was unnervingly tender, instantly soothing the residual sting of the bite. The mark on his neck pulsed, glowing like a dying ember beneath his skin. Bound, she breathed, the possessive rumble returning to her chest. "Anyone who attempts to take you from me will burn to ash." Torin lay there, his chest heaving, his mind reeling from the biological shock of the claim. Before he could process the horrifying permanence of the seal, a sound cut through the silent, fog-choked woods, a slow, rhythmic clapping. "Well, you finally managed to do something useful, Torin." The voice was soft, melodic, perfectly familiar. Torin's blood ran cold. The magical fire coursing through his veins instantly turned to ice. He forced his heavy, aching head to turn toward the tree line. Stepping out from the shadows of the toxic thorns was not the sweet, fragile village girl he had spent 5 years fiercely loving. She was not wearing a simple linen dress, nor did she carry the scent of sea salt and wildflowers. Odette wore the silver-threaded, heavy midnight cloak of a grand inquisitor. She stood tall, her posture rigid with military authority. Behind her, A dozen elite hunters of the guild stepped silently into the moonlight. Their mechanized rifles were already raised, loaded with dense, anti-magic rounds designed specifically to shatter dragon scales. Odette looked down at Torin, battered, bleeding, and pinned beneath the Queen of the Abyss. She smiled. It was a smile completely, terrifyingly devoid of warmth. Chapter 4. Odette, Torin's voice cracked. The word scraped against his throat, a pathetic hollow sound. He shoved himself upward, ignoring the searing pain radiating from the fresh bite mark on his neck. His frantic eyes searched the woman standing in the moonlight, desperately looking for the gentle girl who used to braid seagrass by the docks. She wasn't there. Odette, thank the stars, Torin breathed, stumbling forward. The mud sucked at his boots. You brought the guild. We have to go. We have to... Crack. The back of Odette's gauntleted hand struck his jaw with the force of a battering ram. Torin hit the ground hard. The taste of copper flooded his mouth. His ears rang, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the ambient rustle of the toxic woods. He lay in the dirt, paralyzed not by physical pain, but by the sheer, incomprehensible shock of the blow. He looked up. Odette was wiping a drop of his blood from her silver armor with a look of utter disgust. "Don't touch me, you pathetic burden," she sneered. Her voice, once a soothing melody, was now a sharp, venomous whip. Do you have any idea how exhausting it was? 5 years, Torin. 5 agonizing years playing the devoted, starry-eyed maiden to a boring, obsessive cryptographer. Torin's chest tightened. The air felt thin. What are you talking about? I am talking about the bait, Odette said, gesturing lazily toward the towering, crimson-winged creature slowly rising behind him. The Dragon Queen of the Abyss never leaves her fortress. She is practically a god within those stone walls, but the guild discovered a rumor, a weakness. We learned that the great Zylia harbored a twisted, obsessive fascination with mortal intellect. Odette stepped closer, the heels of her armored boots sinking into the mud. I sold you, Torin. I forged the cipher that led her directly to our village. I staged the kidnapping. And I knew, with your insufferable, stubborn loyalty to me, you would eventually break out and lure her past the boundary line. The world fractured. Torin's brilliant analytical mind, a machine capable of processing thousands of arcane variables in seconds, completely shut down. The foundation of his reality dissolved into ash. Every gentle touch, every whispered promise, every agonizing hour he had spent enduring Zylia's torture just to get back to her. It was all a meticulously crafted lie. The woman he loved had thrown him to a monster just to spring a trap. A low, vibrating snarl shattered the silence. Zylia stepped over Torin. She did not look at the elite hunters surrounding them. She did not look at the heavy artillery aimed at her chest. Her glowing feral eyes were locked solely on Odette. The Dragon Queen extended a blood-soaked wing, deliberately shielding Torin's trembling body from the Inquisitor's view. You dare. Zylia's voice dropped an octave, resonating with archaic, tectonic fury. You dare lay a hand on my mate? Torin's breath hitched. The brand on his neck pulsed fiercely, flooding his veins with a rush of protective territorial heat. He stared at the back of Zylia's legs. The dagger he had plunged into her thigh was still there, blood seeping down her scales. He had stabbed her. He had hated her. Yet here she stood, a bleeding, monstrous tyrant, violently defending him against the righteous woman who had thrown him to the wolves. The brutal irony of it twisted something deep inside his chest. The monster was the only one who truly valued his existence. Odette threw her head back and laughed. The sound was cold and metallic. "Your mate? How touching," Odette mocked. She raised her right hand, her silver rings catching the moonlight. "But I don't care about your little pet lizard. I only care about the bounty on your head." Odette slammed her fist into the earth. Click. It wasn't a spell. It was a mechanical subterranean trigger. The ground violently lurched. A blinding circle of pale blue runes erupted from the mud, forming a massive geometric ring around Zylia and Torin. The vacuum array. Instantly, the ambient sound of the forest vanished. Torin gasped, clutching his throat. The oxygen in the air was being forcibly ripped away, sucked into the glowing runes bordering the trap. But it wasn't just the air. It was the mana. The foundational lifeblood of the earth was being violently extracted. Zylia choked. The magnificent blazing fire crowning her horns sputtered and died. Her wings, once vibrant and incandescent, rapidly dulled to the color of dead ash. The sheer gravitational pressure of the anti-magic field slammed into her shoulders like a falling mountain. She fought it. She bared her fangs, her muscles trembling with supreme effort, refusing to bow before a mortal. But the vacuum was absolute. With a sickening, heavy thud, the Queen of the Abyss was forced to her knees. Her scales began to crack and shed, raining down on the lifeless dirt. Odette stepped casually into the center of the array, entirely unaffected by the field tuned only to arcane blood. She drew a slender, crystalline blade from her hip. She walked up to the kneeling, gasping Dragon Queen, grabbed a fistful of Zylia's dark hair, and wrenched her head back. Odette pressed the absolute zero edge of the blade directly against the center of Zylia's right eye. "Any last words, Your Majesty?" Odette whispered. Chapter 5. The crystalline blade hovered a fraction of an inch from Zylia's right eye. Torin watched the woman he had loved for 5 years prepare to execute the only creature who had actually protected him. He lay in the cold mud, his body bruised and his heart shattered. But as Odette's cruel, triumphant smile stretched across her face, something deep inside Torin's chest quietly snapped. The suffocating panic evaporated. The blinding grief vanished. Only the cold, merciless architecture of logic remained. He stared at the glowing blue runes of the vacuum array encircling them. Odette thought it was a flawless trap, but Torin was a cryptographer. To him, the ancient spell was not a divine weapon. It was just a mathematical equation. And every equation had an inverse. His hand moved to his throat. His fingertips brushed the raised, searing puncture wounds of the blood tear seal. Zylia had forced this bond upon him to siphon his obedience, to tether his soul to her abyssal power. It was a parasitic link, but a bridge built for a conqueror could still be crossed by the captive. Torin closed his eyes. He stopped fighting the agonizing burn of the mark. Instead, he leaned into it. He gathered every ounce of his raw, thundering mortal vitality, his adrenaline, his fury, his uncorrupted life force, and violently shoved it backward through the magical tether. A sharp, breathless gasp echoed across the clearing. Zylia's head jerked back. The dimming ash-gray scales along her jawline suddenly flared with a brilliant, violent crimson. Her fractured amber eyes widened in absolute shock as she felt it. A torrential flood of energy was pouring into her depleted core, not from the earth, but from the fragile human bleeding in the dirt. Torin forced himself to his feet. His joints screamed, but his mind was absolute crystal. "The terrestrial anchor is misaligned," Torin said. His voice was no longer the desperate plea of a broken lover. It was the lethal, unfeeling calculation of an executioner. Odette froze, the blade still poised. She glanced over her shoulder, her brow furrowing in confusion. What did you just say?" Torin did not look at her. He locked eyes with the Dragon Queen. Through the blood bond, he bypassed spoken language entirely, projecting the exact geometric cipher directly into Zylia's mind. "Shift the subterranean flow," Torin commanded through the tether. 3 degrees left. Invert the polarity. Zylia did not hesitate. The arrogant, untouchable sovereign surrendered entirely to the intellect of a mortal. Drawing on the fierce surge of his life force, she slammed her bloody palms flat against the dead earth. The pale blue runes of the vacuum array flickered. Then they violently snapped to a blinding blood-red hue. The vacuum did not just break, it reversed. Instead of draining the ambient magic, the inverted array created a localized gravitational crush. The atmospheric pressure inside the ring multiplied by a factor of 50. The elite hunters did not even have time to scream. Their reinforced silver armor crumpled like cheap tin. The deafening screech of bending metal and shattering bone echoed through the toxic woods as the squad was instantly flattened against the forest floor, pinned by the very trap they had set. Odette stumbled backward, her crystalline blade slipping from her trembling fingers. The anti-magic field shielding her shattered into a million useless sparks. She stared in pale, uncomprehending horror at the pulverized remains of her invincible unit. The dust settled. Torin walked forward. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate calm, stepping over the ruined armor of his former captors. He reached the center of the array and dropped to one knee. Zylia was slumping forward, the sheer exertion of the reverse spell draining the last of her borrowed strength. Torin caught her. He pulled the lethal, imposing queen of the abyss against his chest, supporting her weight. Zylia looked up at him. The feral, possessive monster from the mud was gone. She stared at the sharp, calculating lines of his jaw and the absolute lack of fear in his eyes. He had not just saved her. He had weaponized her magic with a mind more dangerous than any dragon's fire. A new, profound reverence ignited in her chest, replacing her primal hunger with an absolute, terrifying devotion. He was no longer her prisoner. He was a king, commanding a battlefield of his own making. Torin finally turned his gaze to Odette. The look in his eyes was colder than the absolute zero edge of her fallen blade. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," Torin whispered. Odette's face twisted in a mask of pure, desperate terror. She backed away, her boots slipping in the mud. Her grand plan was in ruins. Her hunters were dead. The trap had failed. Cornered and panicking, she reached deep into the lining of her Inquisitor cloak. Her hand emerged, clutching a sphere of swirling, unnatural darkness. The air around it instantly froze, snapping the ambient moisture into jagged frost, the core of absolute misery. A weapon of pure, concentrated, arcane annihilation, designed to permanently entomb immortal beings. With a hysterical scream, Odette hurled the black sphere directly at Zylia's unprotected chest. Chapter 6. The core of absolute misery did not fly through the air. It tore reality apart as it moved. It absorbed all ambient light, a howling sphere of pure, freezing void that screamed toward the exhausted Dragon Queen. Zylia raised a trembling hand. The reversed array had completely drained her abyssal reserves. A pathetic, flickering spark of crimson fire danced at her fingertips, utterly useless against the encroaching destruction. For the first time in her immortal existence, she braced for the end. But the end did not reach her. Torin did not calculate. For the first time in his meticulous, mathematically structured life, the brilliant cryptographer completely ignored the variables. He didn't process the velocity of the weapon. He didn't weigh the logical outcome of a fragile human intercepting a divine curse. He simply moved. With a burst of adrenaline that tore the remaining muscle fibers in his legs, Torin threw his bruised mortal body directly into the path of the void. The impact was entirely silent. There was no explosion, no concussive blast. The pitch-black sphere of arcane ice sank effortlessly into the left side of Torin's chest. The sheer, absolute zero-temperature flash froze his blood the instant it made contact. Jagged necrotic frost violently spiderwebbed outward from his sternum, creeping up his neck and down his arms. His eyes widened in shock as all the air was punched from his collapsing lungs. Torin stumbled backward. Zylia caught him before he hit the dirt. The blistering heat of her scales clashed violently with the unnatural, abyssal cold radiating from his chest, creating a hiss of localized steam. She dropped to her knees, dragging him down with her, cradling his rapidly freezing body against her chest. "No," Zylia breathed. It was a word the sovereign of the abyss had never spoken in defeat. Her fractured amber eyes stared wildly at the black frost consuming the man in her arms. She pressed her glowing, blood-soaked hands over the wound, desperately trying to pump her own heat into his veins. "No, you foolish, fragile thing," she snarled, her voice trembling with an emotion she didn't recognize. "I did not give you permission to die. I command you to heal." Torin choked. A trickle of blood, already turning to crimson slush, spilled past his pale lips. He struggled to focus his rapidly dimming vision on her face. The terrifying, arrogant monster who had chained him to a wall was gone. In her place was a woman paralyzed by a profound, earth-shattering terror. Slowly, agonizingly, Torin lifted his hand. His numb, frost-bitten fingers brushed against her cheek, wiping away a smear of dirt and blood. "Now," Torin whispered. Every syllable was a jagged blade tearing at his throat. He forced a faint ghost of a smile. "I don't owe you a life anymore. I am free." His hand fell away, landing heavily in the mud. His chest stopped moving. Zylia froze, the rhythmic thundering echo of his heartbeat. The mortal drum she had tethered to her own soul stuttered, skipped, and then flatlined into absolute silence. Something deep within the Dragon Queen snapped. It was not a physical fracture, but the violent shattering of an ancient solitary soul. She looked up. Odette was standing at the edge of the clearing, her chest heaving, a twisted victorious smile beginning to form on her lips. The Grand Inquisitor thought she had won. She thought she had slain the beast by breaking its heart. Odette was wrong. She hadn't broken the beast. She had unchained it. A sound tore from Zylia's throat. It was not a roar. It was a scream of pure, world-ending grief. Huyet Long Quang number the blood dragon's fury. The atmosphere instantly ignited. The residual magic of the reversed array shattered completely under the sheer, unadulterated force of her wrath. Crimson fire, a blinding primordial inferno hotter than the core of the earth, and fueled entirely by devastating heartbreak, erupted from Zylia's very bones. The shockwave of heat hit Odette before she could even turn to run. There was no time for the Inquisitor to scream. There was no time for her to beg. The wave of absolute, incinerating flame washed over her, vaporizing her silver armor and mortal flesh in a fraction of a second. She was reduced to a shadow burned into the scorched earth, then blown away as white ash. But Zylia's fury did not stop there. The inferno expanded outward in a catastrophic ring of destruction. The hallucinogenic fog, the jagged bark, the miles of ancient poisoned wood of the toxic thorn forest. All of it was swallowed by the blinding crimson tide. The sky itself turned the color of fresh blood. When the firestorm finally collapsed, nothing remained. The forest was gone, replaced by a vast, smoldering wasteland of white ash drifting down from the sky like snow. In the dead center of the apocalypse, Zylia knelt in the gray dust. She pulled Torin's stiff, lifeless body fully into her lap, burying her face into the crook of his neck. Her tears, hot as molten glass, sizzled as they hit the dark frost covering his skin. She traced the raised puncture wounds of the blood tear seal on his throat. The mark, once glowing with a fierce, possessive crimson, was fading. The vibrant ruby light dulled to a sickly gray, retreating beneath his pale skin until it vanished completely. The tether was broken. His soul was gone. Chapter 7. The ash fell like gray snow. It coated the scorched earth, settling over Zylia's trembling wings and Torin's frozen skin. She stared down at his chest. The silence was absolute. The rhythmic thundering echo of his heartbeat, the mortal drum she had tethered to her own soul, was completely gone. A world without his stubborn, brilliant mind was a terrifying void she refused to accept. "Death does not claim what is mine," she whispered. The words were not a plea. They were an absolute sovereign decree. Zylia raised her right hand. Her obsidian claws extended, dripping with residual crimson fire. Without a single breath of hesitation, she drove them directly into the center of her own chest. Agony, pure and blinding, ripped through her nervous system. She gasped, her spine arching as she tore through scale, muscle, and bone. Reaching deep into the core of her abyssal magic, her fingers closed around a violently pulsing heat. With a sickening crack, she wrenched it free, half of her dragon heart. It was not mere flesh. It was crystallized, incandescent life force. It cast a harsh, red glow against the bleak, ruined landscape, radiating an overwhelming, primordial power. Zylia pressed the bleeding, radiant shard directly against the black frost covering Torin's sternum. "Take it," she commanded, her voice breaking. "Take my fire, take my eternity." The reaction was instantaneous. The absolute zero ice hissed, violently clashing with the blazing heat. The magical shard sank beneath his pale skin, melting through his ribs to fuse completely with his frozen, mortal heart. An agonizing second passed, then another. Thump. It was not the rapid, fragile flutter of a human. It was a deep, resonant boom that echoed the exact heavy rhythm of Zylia's own fractured chest. The necrotic frost rapidly evaporated into steam. Color flooded back into his skin, flushing his veins with a terrifying, vibrant heat. The faded blood tear seal on his neck violently reignited, blazing like a ruby embedded in his flesh. Torin's back arched off the ground. He dragged in a massive, ragged breath. His eyes snapped open. The cool, calculating mortal gaze was gone. His irises burned with a fierce, swirling mixture of his natural storm gray and the predatory, glowing amber of the abyss. He didn't just wake up, he surged upward. Before Zylia could even register the profound relief, Torin's hand shot out. He gripped the lapels of her torn, ash-covered gown and violently hauled her down against him. His mouth crashed against hers. It was a brutal, starving collision of teeth and heat. There was no hesitation, no lingering mortal fear. He tasted like ozone, blood, and the raw, unbridled power she had just surrendered to him. Zylia melted into the kiss, her lethal claws burying themselves gently into his dark hair. She poured every ounce of her remaining strength, her relief, and her dark devotion into his mouth. Torin finally broke the kiss, his chest heaving against hers. His fingers tightened possessively around her waist, anchoring her to him. "You are absolutely insane," Torin rasped. His voice was deeper now, vibrating with a new, dangerous resonance. "You are mine," Zylia answered breathlessly, resting her forehead against his, "and I do not let my treasures break." Torin's lips curved into a sharp, uncompromising smile. Good, because I am never leaving that fortress. You, your magic, your entire kingdom. It all belongs to me now. 3 months later, the fortress of the abyss hummed with an entirely different kind of energy. The crimson pillars still radiated heat, but the oppressive, terrifying silence of the throne room had been replaced by the frantic, echoing scratch of quills on parchment. Torin sat casually on the massive arm of the colossal obsidian throne. He wore dark, tailored silk that did nothing to hide the faint, glowing red veins pulsing faintly beneath the skin of his throat. He was no longer a prisoner. He was the supreme consort, the architect of a new, terrifyingly efficient abyssal regime. Beside him, Zylia leaned back against the velvet cushions. She watched him calculate a complex new defensive perimeter with a look of absolute, unapologetic obsession. He was brilliant, he was ruthless, and he was entirely hers. Down on the floor, beneath the shadow of a grand oak table, Quigley aggressively gnawed on a glowing lump of coal. "This is tyranny," the tiny gargoyle mumbled, spitting out a shower of sparks. "Absolute tyranny. I am a guardian of the ancient dark arts, not a glorified filing clerk. Article 4, subsection B of the new arcane code. Who even writes this nonsense?" Torin didn't look up from his glowing map. "If you complain one more time, Quigley, I'm rewriting the code to include mandatory bath times for stone familiars." Quigley froze. He hugged his lump of coal tighter and shrank back into the shadows, grumbling incoherently about how the Queen had ruined the fortress by bringing a human home. Zylia laughed. It was a dark, melodic sound that filled the massive chamber. She reached out, pulling Torin down by the collar of his shirt until his lips brushed hers. He had cracked her impenetrable walls. He had rewired her kingdom. And in the process, the brilliant, stubborn mortal had completely rewritten her soul. Thank you for listening to the final chapter of this dark romance. If Torin and Zylia's intense journey kept you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe to Velmora Obsession. Don't forget to like, comment with your favorite moment, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next exclusive story.